walked into that hearing room like someone who had done it 100 times and usually left with the headline she wanted. Cameras were already locked in, reporters already typing, and the air had that familiar Capitol Hill charge that says something more than procedure is about to happen. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez knew the setting well enough to move through it almost on muscle memory. For years, hearings had doubled as battlegrounds and broadcast studios, places where sharp lines could turn into viral moments by dinner. This time, though, the script didn't quite unfold the way anyone expected. People later argued about when the shift really began. Some pointed to past gaffes abroad, others to high-profile fashion statements that critics said clashed with populist messaging, and still others to the constant friction between climate rhetoric and the practical realities of modern travel. None of those moments by themselves felt decisive. Politics forgives missteps all the time, especially when a lawmaker has a loyal base and a quick tongue. But sometimes the moment that lingers isn't loud or explosive, just quiet and oddly persistent. On that March morning, the official agenda sounded straightforward: ethics reform, transparency, restoring public trust. The proposed bill aimed to curb stock trading by members of Congress and their families, a topic that regularly polls well across party lines. Ocasio-Cortez had helped sponsor it, and her presence at the witness table signaled alignment with reform. Supporters expected a strong showing, a polished defense of accountability and fairness. Yet everyone in the press gallery seemed to sense a second conversation humming beneath the formal one. It wasn't printed on the schedule, but it floated in the background like a low frequency you feel more than hear. The unspoken topic revolved around image, authenticity, and the long arc from insurgent outsider to national figure. When a politician builds a career on personal narrative, people eventually start measuring that story against the present tense. And that's less about ideology than about identity. Mike Johnson took his seat without theatrics, a single folder resting in front of him. As Speaker, he didn't technically have to be there, but Washington runs on procedural flexibility when leadership wants a closer look. He didn't grandstand, didn't shuffle papers for effect, just waited. Ocasio-Cortez arrived minutes later with the calm precision of a seasoned office that understands optics. They didn't exchange glances, which somehow said more than if they had. Her opening statement landed the way experience statements do: clear, confident, built for both the room and the replay. She acknowledged imperfection, pivoted to systemic flaws, and framed reform as a moral necessity rather than a partisan play. She spoke about working families, about rent anxiety and grocery math, about the distance between power and ordinary life. It was familiar territory, and she moved through it with practiced ease. The room responded with attentive stillness and a few approving nods. Then came the questions, and the temperature shifted a degree. Johnson's tone stayed measured, almost gentle, the cadence of someone who prefers calm persistence to spectacle. He referenced publicly available ethics findings related to her past attendance at a major cultural event, emphasizing that the review had concluded and penalties were resolved. His focus wasn't on relitigating rulings but on timelines and optics. When payments happen, how they happen, and what people infer from that sequence, those were the angles. He mentioned fundraising totals that were also public record, numbers large enough to catch attention in any context. The contrast he drew wasn't framed as accusation, more like a request for explanation. How do significant campaign resources coexist with vendor payment disputes, even if ultimately settled? Is that a bureaucratic lag, a staff oversight, or just the messy reality of modern political operations? Questions like that don't shout, they linger. Ocasio-Cortez answered by pointing to staff processes and the ethics review's conclusions. She emphasized that findings did not allege intentional wrongdoing and that the matter had been addressed. In procedural terms, that's a solid defense, but hearings aren't only about procedure, they're also about perception. And perception often turns on whether an explanation feels complete to people watching from their couches. Johnson returned to the numbers once more, quietly, almost clinically. He wasn't asking about statutes or technical compliance, he said, but about optics and lived experience. If someone providing a service feels pressure before payment arrives, what story does that tell from their side of the invoice? It's not a courtroom question, it's a kitchen table question. And kitchen table questions tend to travel. The discussion moved to foreign policy appearances abroad. A transcript was cited, geography mentioned, and a verbal slip that had already circulated online resurfaced in a more formal setting. Ocasio-Cortez acknowledged the mistake as an inadvertent error. Most people understand that public speaking invites missteps, especially on dense topics. Still, critics wonder whether high-profile stages demand a different margin for error. Johnson's point seemed less about maps and more about preparation. If a lawmaker appears at elite forums to signal readiness for larger responsibilities, observers naturally scrutinize the details. Is a slip just a slip, or does it feed a broader narrative about readiness? Supporters might call it nitpicking. Detractors might call it pattern recognition. The truth probably lives somewhere in the tension between those views. Travel logistics entered the exchange next. Hotel rates, official budgets, the realities of international conferences, mundane facts that can sound charged when placed beside working-class messaging. Ocasio-Cortez defended the necessity of representing constituents on global stages. That argument resonates with people who want their communities visible in powerful rooms. But it also invites a quieter question: visibility at what cost, and judged by whose standards? Climate policy followed, including past proposals that envisioned large-scale changes to transportation systems. Campaign expenditures on air travel surfaced as a talking point. Ocasio-Cortez reiterated a familiar position: systemic problems require systemic solutions, not personal purity tests. Many policy experts agree with that framework. Still, optics don't always wait for nuance. Johnson said he wasn't debating policy theory but public image. If leaders criticize high-carbon lifestyles while living within modern travel norms, does that undermine credibility or simply reflect constraints? Is it fair to expect individual restraint before infrastructure exists? Or is visible restraint part of persuasive leadership? Reasonable people split on that. Then the conversation narrowed to something harder to quantify: brand. Not voting records, not bill text, but the narrative architecture of a political career. Ocasio-Cortez rose to prominence as a symbol of lived experience colliding with entrenched power. That story resonated deeply with people who saw their own lives mirrored in hers. The question Johnson posed was whether the mirror still reflects the same image. He listed several public facts side by side, not as verdicts but as context. Campaign funds, resolved ethics matters, travel details, a speech error. Individually, none define a person. Together, they can create an impression, fair or not. And impressions often drive politics as much as platforms do. Ocasio-Cortez responded by defending her commitment to her constituents and progressive causes. She framed scrutiny as part of the resistance reformers face. That's a narrative many supporters understand instinctively. Reformers, by definition, attract pushback. Yet Johnson gently redirected. The question wasn't about motives, but identification. Fighting for people and being one of them, he suggested, are not identical roles. It wasn't a condemnation, more an observation. Over time, public servants often move from lived similarity to representational advocacy. That shift can be honorable and necessary. But when identity is central to political appeal, the distinction matters. Clips of the exchange spread quickly. Some viewers saw a disciplined legislator pressing fair questions. Others saw selective framing designed to chip away at a rising figure. Social media did what it always does: amplified, fragmented, and reframed. The moment became a Rorschach test. Fundraising followed, as it does in modern campaigns. Supporters rallied, donations spiked, messaging sharpened. Financial metrics suggested resilience. But metrics don't always capture mood. In apartments and kitchens far from Washington, people watched and formed impressions. A young volunteer in the Bronx recorded a thoughtful video saying she still supported Ocasio-Cortez but wished the question had been answered more directly. An electrician who had voted consistently for her told his son the exchange felt different, though not necessarily decisive. These weren't pundits. They were people measuring story against experience. Their reflections weren't hostile, just reflective. They understood growth, success, and the realities of national politics. They also understood the subtle difference between shared circumstances and distant advocacy. That difference isn't a moral failing, it's a human transition. Still, transitions change narratives. Late at night, one imagines even seasoned politicians replaying moments in quieter tones. Public confidence doesn't cancel private reflection. Did the answers land as intended? Did the questions resonate more than expected? Politics rarely offers clean feedback, only signals. Campaigns analyze data, donor trends, demographic shifts. A slight dip here, a surge there, numbers that hint without fully explaining. Analysts debate what's noise and what's signal. Sometimes the smallest movements say the most. Challengers eventually appear, sensing opportunity or simply fulfilling civic impulse. That's democracy functioning as designed. Incumbents welcome competition publicly and prepare intensely behind the scenes. Statements emphasize service and results. Reporters ask whether hearings change landscapes. Leaders answer cautiously, rarely claiming more than procedural intent. Oversight is oversight, they say. Voters will decide. And voters do, but not always for the reasons commentators predict. They weigh policy, personality, performance, and that elusive thing called trust. Trust isn't binary, it's textured, built from stories people tell themselves about who represents them. When stories evolve, trust recalibrates. None of this requires villains or heroes. It's possible for a lawmaker to act in good faith and still face uncomfortable optics. It's possible for critics to ask fair questions and still carry partisan motives. Politics lives in that gray space. What remains is the central tension, authenticity over time. Can someone rise, succeed, adapt, and still feel familiar to the people who first saw themselves reflected? Is evolution a betrayal or simply adulthood in public view? And who gets to decide the answer? I don't pretend certainty here. I see a skilled representative navigating scrutiny that comes with national stature. I also see constituents asking sincere questions about alignment between message and life. Both realities can exist simultaneously. Maybe the lesson isn't about one hearing or one exchange. Maybe it's about how modern politics compresses biography, branding, and governance into a single continuous performance. Every choice becomes symbolic. Every symbol invites interpretation. In that environment, clarity matters, but so does humility. Saying, "I fight for you" is powerful. Saying, "I'm still one of you" is different. The distance between those phrases is small in wording, large in feeling. Whether that distance grows or shrinks depends on countless decisions yet to be made. Voters will keep watching not just speeches but patterns. They'll weigh intent against impression, policy against posture, and they'll do it quietly, in kitchens and buses and late-night scrolls. No single clip settles that kind of question, but sometimes a calm voice in a crowded room names a tension people already sensed. Once named, it's hard to ignore. And ignoring is rarely how democracy moves forward. By the next morning, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Mike Johnson were no longer talking to each other in a hearing room. They were talking to each other through America. That is what those moments become now. One person says something under oath, another person answers with a sentence so clean it sounds pre-written even when it probably was not, and then the country spends the next 48 hours pretending it is debating policy when it is really debating character. The argument was no longer about the Restore Trust in Congress Act by breakfast. It was about whether Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had outgrown the story that made her powerful, and whether Mike Johnson had found the one way to ask that question without sounding like he was trying to punish her for existing. That was the part that unsettled her allies most. If Mike Johnson had come in loud, if he had sneered, if he had delivered the usual cable news caricature of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez as some kind of cartoon left-wing celebrity, she would have cut him to pieces. She had done it before. She had built half a national profile on the ability to turn contempt into fuel. But he had not come at her with contempt. He had come at her with documents, with numbers, with a tone so measured it forced every viewer to lean in and decide for themselves whether they were watching Oversight or something more delicate and more dangerous, a credibility test. Inside her office, nobody said that phrase out loud at first. Communications people rarely do. They prefer terms like contrast, framing, counter-narrative, message discipline. Those are clean professional words, the kind people use when they want to sound strategic instead of worried. But worry was there all the same. It sat in the room with the polling memos, with the internal dashboards, with the half-drunk iced coffees on desks across the office. The first hour after the hearing, her staff did what staffs always do when a principal takes a hit that may or may not be a hit. They hunted for the friendliest clips, the most flattering reactions, the strongest surrogate quotes. They found some. Of course they did. In American politics, nobody falls without someone immediately posting that they actually won. But there was a complication, and it was not coming from the right. Republicans had already decided what they thought of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez years ago. They were not the problem. The problem was that the discomfort was showing up in softer places, among the people who usually defended her before she even asked. Young progressives were still posting support, still praising her record, still reminding the internet that she had pushed issues others ignored. Yet mixed into that support was something her team could not easily screenshot and turn into a fundraising graphic. It was hesitation. Not rejection, not revolt, just that slight pause people make when a question lands closer to the bone than they expected. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez could feel that pause before anyone showed her data. Politicians at her level always can. They know the difference between being attacked and being doubted. Attack usually creates energy, doubt creates quiet. Quiet is worse. Quiet does not trend as neatly. Quiet does not produce outrage spikes. Quiet looks like supporters watching a clip twice before they repost it. Quiet looks like someone typing a defense and deleting it. Quiet looks like a donor reading an email, agreeing with the message, and somehow not clicking the button anyway. Mike Johnson, for his part, understood exactly what had happened, even if he would never describe it that way in public. He had not exposed a scandal. He had not produced some cinematic revelation out of a manila folder while the cameras gasped. Washington is addicted to those fantasies because they make politics look like courtroom drama, but real political damage usually happens through contrast, not revelation. You place the statement next to the record, the biography next to the present tense lifestyle, the rhetoric next to the awkward little details, and then you let the audience do the subtraction themselves. Mike Johnson had not gotten Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the simple partisan sense. He had done something more disciplined. He had made her explain the gap between symbol and office. And once that gap is visible, even people who still admire you start measuring it. That is unfair in one sense because every politician changes. Of course they do. Nobody serves 8 years in Congress and remains exactly who they were the week they arrived. The city changes them, security changes them, money changes the orbit around them, fame changes how strangers look at them, and the simple fact of no longer having to wonder whether your debit card will clear changes how you walk through the world. That does not make you fake. It makes you successful. But success creates its own political trap when your entire rise was narrated as proof that you had not been absorbed by the machine. By noon, liberal commentators were trying to rescue the frame. Some said Mike Johnson had fixated on optics because he had no argument against reform. Some argued that he was doing what Washington always does when a woman from outside the usual pipeline refuses to stay in the role assigned to her. Some of that was persuasive. Washington does treat insurgent women differently, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has had to absorb a level of scrutiny most male members never face. But even those defenses had a weakness. They addressed motive more easily than substance. They explained why Mike Johnson might want to ask the question. They did not fully answer why the question had landed. That afternoon, a reporter caught one of her Democratic colleagues in a hallway and asked the kind of question lawmakers hate because it sounds neutral while functioning like a trap. Do you think Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez answered Speaker Mike Johnson's central concern? The congressman smiled the way politicians smile when they are trying to buy themselves 2 seconds of thought. Then he gave the standard answer about her long commitment to working families and the need to stay focused on the legislation, which was fine, professional, perfectly acceptable Washington speech. It was also a non-answer, and everyone listening knew it. That was becoming the pattern. The people around her could defend her values, defend her record, defend her intent. Fewer of them seemed eager to answer the precise question Mike Johnson had asked. Part of that was because the question itself was uncomfortable in a way ideological debates are not. Arguments about tax rates, energy policy, military spending, regulatory authority, those things are easy compared to authenticity. Authenticity is slippery. It is part biography, part feeling, part projection. It cannot be proved with a vote tally. If Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez says she still understands working-class life, who can measure that with perfect accuracy? If Mike Johnson suggests distance has entered the picture, can he quantify that without sounding patronizing? Not really. And yet millions of people watching the exchange felt they knew exactly what he meant. Politics is full of truths that would collapse under formal standards of evidence and still govern how people vote. That evening, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez met with senior staff and 2 outside advisors in her Washington apartment. The mood, according to the version later described by people who heard about it secondhand, was not panicked but brittle. There is a difference. Panic is loud. Brittle is controlled but dangerous, like glass under pressure. One advisor argued that the entire thing should be reframed as a familiar right-wing obsession with reducing policy arguments to lifestyle gotchas. Another said the response had to be more personal, less ideological, that she needed to speak directly to the people in the Bronx and Queens who had seen the clip and felt that strange little drop in their stomach. A third warned against overcorrecting. The minute you act wounded, this person reportedly said, you confirm there's a wound. That was smart advice and maybe bad advice at the same time. In politics, refusing to acknowledge a wound can make it look deeper, but acknowledging it badly can make it look mortal. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez listened to all of it, arms folded, not saying much. She had reached the level where people around her were skilled enough to speak carefully and loyal enough to mean well, but that did not change the basic loneliness of the decision. In the end, only she could choose whether to answer Mike Johnson's question directly. Only she could decide whether she wanted to say in plain English, yes, I have changed. Yes, office changes people. Yes, I live differently now than I did in 2018. And no, that does not mean I have forgotten anything that matters. The cleanest answer available to her was also the riskiest. Because if Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had said that plainly, many voters might have respected it. They might even have admired it. Honesty about transformation can be politically powerful when delivered with enough confidence, but it also would have surrendered the old myth in its pure form. It would have admitted that Mike Johnson, of all people, had forced a real distinction into the open. Politicians do not like granting that kind of victory, especially not to an opponent who knows how to turn restraint into leverage. So instead, the team leaned where teams usually lean: strength, defiance, mobilization. The external message remained essentially the same. Republicans were trying to silence a progressive voice. Supporters should fight back. Donations remained welcome, and donations did come in. Enough to generate good headlines, enough to steady nerves, enough for allies to point to numbers and say this had all been overblown. But money is an imperfect language. Money can tell you who is still with you. It cannot always tell you how they are with you. Some people give because they are inspired. Some give because they are angry. Some give because they hate the other side more than they worry about yours. A donation can be loyalty, but it can also be insurance, a way of saying, I still choose you, though I am less sure than I was yesterday. Campaigns rarely admit that distinction because campaigns are built to translate every receipt into confidence. 3 days later, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez did what experienced politicians do when Washington feels too close. She went home to the district. Not home in the sentimental sense, home in the representational sense, the calendar-blocked, staff-coordinated, press-managed return to the neighborhoods that built your mythology. She toured a community center, spoke with tenants dealing with rent pressure, visited a small business corridor, stood beside local leaders and nodded as they described the cost of groceries, transportation, childcare, all the things that make abstract economics feel like concrete weather. In another season, the footage would have looked reassuring. This time it looked slightly different, not because she changed, but because the audience had. Once people begin actively asking whether a politician still feels like one of them, every image starts answering whether it wants to or not. At one stop, a woman in her 30s asked a simple question during a rope line conversation. It was not hostile. That was what made it memorable. She said she still supported Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, still admired her, still thought she had done more than most people in Washington to make ordinary New Yorkers feel seen. Then she asked, softly enough that aides around them had to lean in, "Do you think you still live like us?" The congresswoman smiled, touched the woman's arm, and launched into a thoughtful answer about carrying the community with her everywhere she goes, about how the pressures of office can never erase where she comes from, about staying grounded in the district. It was warm, articulate, empathetic, and somehow still not quite an answer. The woman nodded anyway. People are polite in person in ways they never are online. But later that clip spread too, not because anything dramatic happened, but because the same question had now followed her out of Washington and onto the street. Mike Johnson watched all of this the way disciplined politicians watch opponents, with interest but no visible glee. Publicly, he stayed careful. He praised the bill's progress, repeated that the purpose of hearings was oversight, and refused invitations to turn the exchange into some kind of blood sport. Privately, though, Republicans understood they had found an argument that traveled beyond their usual audience. It was not Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is radical. That one had been exhausted long ago. It was not Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is hypocritical in the crude talk radio sense, because that word tends to activate defenses before the case is even made. The more effective message was subtler. Perhaps she had become exactly what fame and office usually create, a person still fluent in working-class language but no longer bounded by working-class life. That is a much harder claim to swat away because it does not require voters to stop liking her. It only requires them to see her differently. Democrats recognized the danger immediately. Not all of them liked Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, but many respected her utility, her reach, her ability to electrify younger voters and drag national media toward issues the party establishment preferred to handle quietly. They did not want her weakened, especially not by Republicans. At the same time, some older Democrats privately found the whole thing uncomfortably revealing, not because they thought Mike Johnson was right about everything, but because they had seen this arc before. Outsider arrives, outsider conquers, outsider becomes institution while still speaking the grammar of insurgency. It is one of the oldest transformations in American politics. The only unusual part was that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had built so much of her power on persuading people that transformation would never happen to her. The next week, a long-form magazine piece appeared trying to split the difference. It described Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez as a politician caught between biography and scale, between the local intimacy that created her and the national stature that now sustains her. The article noted that Mike Johnson had not really accused her of wrongdoing so much as of distance, and distance is the one thing no rising politician can entirely avoid. The piece was fair, almost annoyingly fair, and that made it influential. Partisans could ignore hostile attacks. They had a harder time dismissing calm analyses that treated both Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Mike Johnson as rational actors trapped inside larger incentives. In one especially sharp paragraph, the writer observed that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's dilemma was not that she had changed, but that she still needed the country to feel as if she had not changed in any way that mattered. That is a brutal sentence for a modern politician because it captures the impossible demand at the center of populist success. Voters want representatives who rise high enough to fight effectively and remain emotionally legible after they rise. They want polish without distance, power without assimilation, fame without insulation. They want the old friend who somehow also got a security detail, a leadership slot, and international speaking invitations without ever developing the faintest smell of the professional class. That person almost never exists for long, but politics keeps selling the idea because people keep buying it. So the hearing did not destroy Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. It did not end her career, shatter her coalition, or suddenly turn the Bronx and Queens into hostile ground. Those are fantasy endings written by people who confuse virality with finality. What it did do was more subtle and in some ways more consequential. It placed a question mark inside her narrative where before there had mostly been an exclamation point. Mike Johnson did not supply the answer, he only supplied the pause. And in politics, a well-timed pause can be devastating because it gives voters room to hear themselves think. For Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the problem now was not that Mike Johnson had wounded her in public. It was that he had made certain private conversations harder to avoid. Conversations among supporters, conversations among local activists, conversations among people too young to remember politics before social media, but old enough to recognize when a brand begins hardening into an institution. They were not asking whether she was corrupt, because that would have been easy to reject. They were asking whether she was still proximate, still intimate with the life she invoked, still speaking from inside it rather than from above it. Those are quieter questions, but they stay around longer. And somewhere in all this was the irony Mike Johnson himself likely appreciated. He, a Southern conservative lawyer turned speaker, was now benefiting from a line of attack that depended on sounding almost sociological. He was not winning by calling Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez extreme. He was winning, at least for the moment, by sounding like a man who understood class distance better than the most famous democratic socialist in America. That is not an ideological triumph, that is a rhetorical one. And rhetorical victories are often the ones that age best because they plant themselves inside future arguments. The next time Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez talks about struggle, voters will hear Mike Johnson's questions somewhere in the background. Not everyone, not always, but enough to matter.